We wish today to update members on the Executive decision following our consideration of the Truth Recovery Design Panel's report on mother and baby institutions, Magdalene Laundries and Workhouses. And at the outset, let me say, as always is the case when I speak about this issue, our thoughts are very much with the women and their children who were treated in the most barbaric, inhumane and disrespectful way in these institutions across this island. It can never be forgotten that what we're talking about here, in many cases, is women who've had their babies taken from their arms and moved without their consent across and between jurisdictions. And they're now grown children who do not know their identity, their family or their medical history. The publication of the report represents a major step forward for victims and survivors. I am therefore pleased to inform members that the Executive has agreed all of the recommendations in the panel's report. So let me outline the 5 recommendations and how the Executive proposes to proceed. As members will be aware, in January this year, the former First Minister made a statement to the House reflecting the decision by the Executive to undertake an independent investigation into these institutions, following the publication of research by Queen's University and the University of Ulster. This lifted the veil on the horrendous experiences of women and girls and their children admitted to these institutions over the many decades running up to the late 1990s. The research uncovered some shocking and disturbing facts. Over 10,500 women entered mother and baby institutions over a 68-year period between 1922 and 1990. The youngest was 12 years of age. The oldest was 44, and around a third of these girls were under 19. They came from across Ireland, and a smaller number came from Britain and elsewhere. Appallingly, a number were the victims of sexual crime, including rape and incest, and shamefully, the majority were made to feel that they, and not the perpetrator, were to blame. Shamefully, around a quarter of the babies born in these institutions were placed for adoption. A further third were sent to baby homes, and others were boarded out or fostered in today's terms. The outcome? Countless women and girls were separated from their babies at birth or soon after, often without their consent or an understanding of what was happening. As a mother, that fills me with unfathomable sadness that anybody would have to go through that. A further 3,500 women and girls entered industrial homes or Magdalene Laundries. Some were transferred after their baby's birth from the mother and baby home to atone for their so-called sins. Some were admitted because they had learning disabilities and others because they had mental health issues. In the Magdalene Laundries, women and girls were forced to work without pay. They were stripped of their identities. Some spent their whole life there, and when they died, they were buried from there. That their children would also suffer the consequence of these practices, with some facing horrific abuse in children's homes, and many others spent years of their lives trying to find out who they are and being misled, is just not acceptable. That adopted people still can't access their records that contain information about who they are or their family medical history is also not acceptable or tenable. The research throws into stark for us all to see that these women, and they should have been shown love, they should have been shown sympathy and kindness. They were instead isolated and they were excluded. Suffering was compounded on suffering. So let's call this out for what it was: abuse, violation. Women and girls had done no wrong and they were punished for becoming pregnant outside of marriage. They were punished because they were the victims of rape and incest. They were humiliated and they were subjected to forced labour. They were robbed of their babies and they were denied the truth, and it was wrong on every level. I'm sure, Mr Speaker, that members will share my deep outrage that any of this was allowed to happen. But the shameful truth is that it did, and it involved a cover-up with church and state. This research, although comprehensive, left a number of unanswered questions, particularly in relation to adoption and infant mortality. This prompted the Executive to undertake an independent investigation shaped by the views of victims and survivors of the institutions, including the now adult children of women from mother and baby institutions. In April this year, the Minister of Health took this forward and established a Truth Recovery Design Panel to include experts Dr Maeve O'Rourke, Professor Phil Scratton and Deirdre Mahan. Ms Mahan served as the chair. I want to put on record my personal thanks and that of the entire Executive for the panel's delivery of a comprehensive report within a challenging 6-month timeframe. I also want to acknowledge the importance of the co-design and participatory nature of how the work was undertaken, and I particularly want to thank the 186 victims and survivors, some from as far away as California, Australia and Canada, who have worked alongside them tirelessly, devoted to the pursuit of justice. I also want to thank Judith Gillespie, the independent chair of the Interdepartmental Working Group that was responsible for overseeing this work. It's also important that we recognise the contribution of a range of individuals and bodies, some of whom have maintained a long-term interest in these institutions and the fates of their residents. The panel published and delivered its report on the 5th of October, and I, along with the First Minister, the Minister for Health, Junior Minister Middleton and Judith Gillespie, met them to discuss the report's findings and its recommendations. The panel's report makes 5 core recommendations and explains the rationale, the timing, the interdependencies of each one. This means, as challenging as implementation will be, it's not a question of choosing one recommendation over another, but instead one of delivering them as a package. In doing so, we can't lose sight of the fact that we're trying to address both past and present human rights violations. Cherry-picking the report's recommendations wasn't an option. Unequivocal acceptance and full implementation of the panel's recommendations is the very least that we can do for victims and survivors. The age profile of the victims and survivors means that we cannot afford to delay progress for one day longer. Many are likely to be in their 70s and their adult children in their 50s, and sadly some are no longer with us. They have all waited for far too long, and we are not going to stand by and allow them to wait any longer. Before I take members through the implementation proposals, I think it's worth reflecting on the individual recommendations. Recommendation 1 sets out the 6 integrated principles designed to guide all of our future work and reflect the priorities identified by victims and survivors. They include sufficient funding to support implementation, the centrality of human rights, full information access, policies and practices are trauma-informed, accessibility of future investigations to victims and survivors, in particular by those with disabilities, inclusivity, particularly for victims and survivors and their relatives affected by cross-border practices, the wider diaspora and relatives of the deceased. Recommendation 2 focuses on implementation responsibility and makes specific reference to securing funding and cooperation with the Irish Government. This is relevant as we know there is a strong all-island dimension at play. Some women and children moved of their own accord, and many babies were moved across the jurisdictions, often without the consent or the knowledge of their mothers. The result being that for some women and their adult children, the full picture will only be established and the absolute truth arrived at when full access to information in both jurisdictions is secured. This places an onus on both the Irish Government and the Executive to work together on its delivery. Recommendation 3 is unique, proposing the establishment of an integrated truth investigation made up of an expert independent panel and a public inquiry. Both will have an investigative role, gathering and assessing and analysing information from records and individuals to make evidence-based recommendations. They will differ in that the expert panel is non-statutory, whereas the inquiry will be established in law by the passage of an appropriate Assembly bill. This dual approach means we can press ahead with the expert independent panel virtually immediately. There is also a very real opportunity for it to shape the public inquiry and its final terms of reference. It is hoped that the institutions will cooperate with the expert panel voluntarily, but if they don't, the public inquiry can compel them. The needs and wishes of victims and survivors will be front and centre. How each individual chooses to engage with the integrated truth investigation is totally at their own discretion. They can participate publicly or privately in both the panel and the inquiry, or in one only, and they can change their mind at any time. And finally, the records generated will potentially be the nucleus of a permanent archive. Recommendation 4 on access to records, I understand, was a matter of universal importance to victims and survivors, including their now adult children who were taken from their mothers at birth. Full access to existing records is what's overwhelmingly wanted and needed to give a true picture to the past, to help victims and survivors come to terms with the present and to move forward with their lives. So there are a number of elements to this recommendation. Firstly, the introduction of a statutory duty to compel the relevant institutions, adoption-related bodies and baby homes to preserve and not destroy relevant records. Therefore, material relevant to any future investigation is properly secured and also readily available. Secondly, the development of data protection guidance designed to advise data controllers of historical, institutional and adoption records on fulfilment of their obligations. And then thirdly, the establishment of a dedicated permanent independent repository underpinned by legislation. It's likely that this will include all personal and administrative records relating to historical practices within a range of social care institutions and the adoption system. And finally, then, Recommendation 5 relates to the redress and reparation package, including resourcing of services identified by the VSS service co-design exercise, financial assistance, a prominent memorial and citizenship for those who, due to their removal from the jurisdiction as a child, lost their entitlement, a financial redress scheme for women and their adult children made up of an automatic standardised payment and the entitlement to a further individually assessed payment. Victims and survivors should be consulted on its design. It also should not be means-tested or compromise existing social welfare benefit. Engagement with non-state institutions, organisations and agencies to establish potential financial contribution. So, Mr Speaker, as you can see, the recommendations are comprehensive and they're far-reaching, and there's no doubt that implementation will involve a significant work programme and also a sizeable funding package. But going forward, we are committed to engaging and to listening. But as I've indicated, we do not have the luxury of time, and it's crucial that we move rapidly on all the issues. Therefore, the Executive has agreed all the recommendations, and work will continue at pace to finalise details and take the next steps as quickly as possible. Indeed, such is our determination to move forward at speed that we have agreed some actions that will be taken forward immediately. We will establish the consultative forum in line with accessibility principle in Recommendation 1 and an expert panel within the next 6 months as outlined in Recommendation 3. Victims and survivors will be represented on the expert independent panel, and the consultative forum will be given a role in terms of its appointments. Although the legislation required to establish the public inquiry can only be progressed in the next mandate, we can and will initiate any required groundwork now. We will begin the work on financial redress right away, including discussions with HMRC and the Treasury, and undertaking the groundwork for the legislation that will be required to ensure that payments are not means-tested and welfare benefits, for example, are not impacted. The Department of Health is already considering including a duty to preserve and not destroy relevant records in the Adoption and Children's Bill currently before the Assembly, and instructions to Council have already issued. So it's very clear this will be a complex and it will be cross-cutting work. For example, the creation of an archive may appear straightforward, but the practicalities of it, including the use of Public Records Office, are unclear. Any memorial will require careful thought and attention and must be progressed in a process of consultation and co-design with the victims and survivors. Citizenship is a reserved matter falling to the Home Office and therefore outside the Assembly's ambit. These issues and other issues that arise will be considered in detail by the programme, which will be led by the Executive Office. And to ensure strong coordination across all departments, we have agreed that the Executive Office will lead on this programme, including on the inquiry and redress. One of our senior officials in TEO will take on the senior responsible owner role as the key decision-maker. TEO will therefore have the overall responsibility for delivering the objectives of the programme, and other departments will of course have significant involvement in this work as it progresses. The First Minister and myself earlier we met virtually with a group of victims and survivors, and we're making arrangements to meet them in person in coming weeks. This morning we discussed with them the decisions of the Executive and outlined our next steps. And I can say to the House that they welcomed those decisions, they felt a sense of relief, they felt that they were being acknowledged, and they felt that this was a momentous day. But they also left us in no doubt that what they need to see now is concrete action and full delivery on the recommendations. And today, Cancorlia, on behalf of the Executive, we make that commitment to them. I believe this is a watershed moment for the women and adult children of mother and baby institutions, of Magdalene Laundries and of workhouses. And we must remember that this will be a difficult and an emotional day for many. Our thoughts are very much with all the victims and survivors who are so grievously failed and have lived for many years with the unimaginable pain and trauma inflicted on them. Excuse me. Their needs are our absolute priority, and it's been a long and arduous journey, but today they are one step closer to getting the truth that has been denied to them for decades. Today, we stand united in support of all victims and survivors, and we want to send a very clear message that we will do everything in our power to ensure you get the truth, the justice and the redress that you deserve. We will continue to keep members updated as we make progress, and all of us in this House will have a part to play in delivering on this crucial work. Ceann Comhairle, I commend the report of the Truth Recovery Design Panel to the House, and will finish by echoing the words of the report. Let the truth be known and transparency achieved.
Thank you, and I call the Chairperson of the Committee for the Executive Office, Sinead McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the First Ministers for this statement and welcome some action on this matter, the lack of which to date has caused some considerable frustration among the victims and survivors. On behalf of the committee, I would also like to echo your sentiments that what these women and their children endured should never have happened, and that we must all ensure that it never happens again, and can we address the harm caused to those who had to go through these institutions. The committee has been working to address concerns raised by victims and survivors of historical institute abuse, not least the impersonal legalistic approach to the redress process and the long outstanding need for a formal apology. Can I ask the First and Deputy First Minister what steps that they have taken to ensure that the same mistakes are not made with victims and survivors of the mother and baby homes?
Thanks to the member for her questions, and I look forward to working with the Chair of the Committee as we progress these recommendations. My message to everybody today would be, let's do this together. We have a huge opportunity, if you like, to support victims and survivors that have been failed at every turn. So I want to work with every single member of this Assembly to make sure we do right and we actually start to lift some of the burden that's been inflicted on these women and girls for far too long. So I will work with the member, and I think it's really, really important that we learn lessons of what's happened here, but also what's happened in other jurisdictions, and don't fall foul of the same things that have been identified elsewhere. So I think when it comes to, for example, the issue of an apology, it's so important that we actually reflect what is requested from the victims and survivors themselves. So I think the consultative forum is going to be the key mechanism in which to allow victims and survivors to be able to input into that, and then let's speedily return with a fulsome apology from ourselves to the victims and survivors. And I want to do that as quickly as possible. I've set out some of the things that we can do in quicker time and some things that will take a little bit longer, but let's keep building on the momentum that we have at this point, and let's just continue to make progress and make sure we send a very strong message to all the victims and survivors, many of which are watching this debate today, that we are going to work together and we are going to do this together and we are going to support them together as we work our way through all the things that we have taken on board in terms of the recommendations.
Call Linda Dillon.
Ceann Comhairle, and can I thank the Minister for the statement to the House today, and she is correct when she says that many of the victims and survivors will be watching this statement being made and the questions that we ask. And again, just to say that our thoughts are with all of those victims and survivors. Minister, I regularly engage with both the mothers, birth mothers and the adopted children, and have again engaged with them over the past weekend. And whilst they may have had the same starting point and started their journey from the same place, their journeys are very different and have been very different, and therefore their needs are very different. And I just would like to ask, could we get some assurance that the needs of both of these groups of people and their families will be fully met? And Minister, can you also acknowledge that the women and girls that went into these institutions suffered abuse, shame and stigma that they have carried with them through their entire lives? The shame is not theirs, and they should not own it. And today we need to ensure that we lift that shame.
Thank you for the question, and I'm very conscious of, I know you work closely with a lot of victims and survivors, and so I absolutely take on board your point, particularly in relation. I'm very conscious of the fact that there are different needs, particularly between birth mothers and also those of adopted children. And I think it's a terrible indictment on society that for many decades that so many mothers were burdened with this immeasurable shame and stigma, and that burden was placed on them by society and also by those who sought to cover up what happened in institutions. And it was the worst kind of abuse, of trauma that anybody could ever experience. So I hope that today, in taking forward these recommendations, I hope it goes some way to lift that burden from the women. And I think that the message that I would say today for us to send out very strongly together is that that the stigma and the shame must end, and it must end now.
I call Christopher Salford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sir, when you take someone's child from them and remove it from them and, in some cases, sell them to wealthy couples, you're engaging in human trafficking. When you force someone to work, sometimes to the point of their death, without paying them for their work, you're engaging in slavery. And when you then attempt to apply a veneer of the love of Christ upon it, you're engaging in lies. The institutions responsible for this gave it up not because they had some turnaround and change of heart, they gave it up because the profit went out of it. Can I ask the Deputy First Minister, given that some of these institutions sit on vast resources, that she and her colleague, the First Minister, and all executive ministers will pursue them throughout to ensure that an adequate and fair recompense is made to the victims of their actions?
Yes, and again, I want to acknowledge the members' work on this area, and particularly having been consistent for many years in raising the issue. I think you're absolutely right, and it's so appropriate, or it's not appropriate, it's necessary that those institutions that were involved in this heinous crimes towards women and then spent so many years trying to cover it up, that they should also then pay for the redress. So I think it's appropriate that we seek the right contribution from them, and I hope that they comply willingly, but if they don't, then we will legislate to take that power. And I think that's a very strong message again that we want the victims and survivors to hear today, that we will act and that we will compel those organisations that fail to do the right thing whenever it's been asked of them at this time.
Call Meg Nesbitt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her statement. I want to give an unconditional welcome to the unequivocal nature of the statement and the commitment that finally the victims and survivors of mother and baby homes and Magdalene Laundries will join the victims and survivors of historical institutional abuse in gaining redress. There is, however, a third group, the victims and survivors who were abused in non-institutional settings, and some of them may be watching this debate today in hope rather than expectation. What can the Deputy First Minister say to that group of victims?
I think the thing I would want to say is that nobody will be left behind, and that we'll do everything that we can to make sure that everybody is properly supported and that they have access to truth and justice, and the very same experience and trauma that they experience, whether that be in an institution or in a home, needs to be acknowledged and rectified. So I think that we need to ensure that we send a message out to all victims and survivors that no stone will be left unturned in terms of supporting you and going forward. And throughout the executive, across whether that be clerical abuse, institutional abuse, abuse in the home, all those things, I think we have to make sure that we do the right thing at this turn for all those that have been hurt in such a horrible way over many, many decades.
I call Paula Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, First Minister and Deputy First Minister, for this statement today. Before I ask my question, I would like to put on record my immense admiration for the birth mothers and adoptees for the dignity throughout this process and getting to this point today. I mean, it's been so inspiring. Deputy First Minister, you will know that during the research period there were disclosures to the researchers around the nature of the sexual crimes, and I'm just wondering what support is going to be given to the birth mothers and the adoptees to support them in the investigations, criminal investigations going forward, because the public inquiry won't stretch that far. Thank you.
Thanks, and just to acknowledge, like the member, I mean, this day belongs to the victims and survivors who've campaigned for so long to get to this point, and I reflected just in my introductory comments just some of the things that were said to ourselves in the meeting which we had with them before coming into the chamber, and it certainly is. They described it as a momentous day, you know, but what they expect from us is the return in terms of what we're going to do and how we're going to drive this forward. So we want them to hear that we're taking this, that this is a priority, and we are going to deliver all the commitments which we've set out. I think in terms of how we support victims and survivors, particularly through a public inquiry, we're doing something that nowhere else has, insofar as we're doing a statutory public inquiry, which is more legalistic, but alongside that we'll have the work of the independent panel, and people can choose to be part of both or one. And I think that as part of the other leg to that work, if you like, is the consultative forum, and that's where victims and survivors will tell us what they need. And I think that's where you'll hear, particularly if you need support in terms of approaching the panel, making your contribution, whether that be in writing or verbally, whatever suits the individual themselves. So I think it'll be a crucial part actually of us being able to support victims and survivors, that we actually get that right, but let them tell us what they need as part of the consultative forum.
Colin Sheeran.
And I thank the Joint First Minister for her statement. I also want to acknowledge the fact that the Executive Office have undertaken this responsibility for the public inquiry. And can I ask the Joint First Minister why the process has to be a legislative one, and how likely the legislative process for both the public inquiry and the redress board is likely to take?
Thanks for the question. I think essentially what we're saying is that we're putting the inquiry into legislation because it gives us the power, if we need it, to compel organisations to cooperate. And whilst, as I said earlier, we hope that that's not where we get to, we don't want to have to do that, however we will do that. I hope that organisations will cooperate with the panel, and that that work will start now ahead of the inquiry, but I think that we need to ensure that we have the legislation just in case that we need it. In terms of the time frame, we will work to get this moving as quickly as we can. Furthermore, I think it's essential that there is appropriate consultation again with victims and survivors, because we've made a firm commitment to them that they'll be at the heart of everything that we do. So we want to talk to them about that as well. But it's clear that, just given that we're coming towards the end of this mandate, and it's going to be the next mandate before the legislation can be introduced. However, that's not to say we're going to wait to then. We're going to actually start the work now and have the groundwork done, that we're able to hit the ground running in the new mandate.
Robin Newton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her statement today. Minister, within this statement you have emphasised that the shame is not with the girl or the woman, indeed that they were indeed the victim, and they were the victim of males who created the abuse, who brought about the abuse of that individual person. But there were also males who created the institutions and propagated those institutions for the very long history of the institutions. So the male species is really in a very bad place in this report. Can I thank the Minister for the agreement that indeed it's a unanimous support from the Executive on this report, and indeed that you will not cherry-pick on the various aspects of the recommendations of the report. But could I draw you, Minister, to, as you outlined on page 13, the financial redress scheme for women and their adult children, made up of entitlement and individually assessed payments, and indeed that those will not be means-tested or compromised. That obviously is a big task, and not a task that can be settled in Northern Ireland. Could I ask you, Minister, when indeed that work, direct contact work, and when you would expect to have the package in place for the victims?
Just to concur in terms of your commentary around, there's a very shameful truth in our history in terms of what's happened to far too many women and girls. And I think that when we look at the issue of redress, and indeed many of the other things, there are a number of things that are yet to be decided. And again, we said victims and survivors will be to the centre of all of that. So there are a number of matters that we have to develop further. We're looking at, particularly when it comes to redress, we're looking at schemes in other jurisdictions, how it's been done elsewhere. We're taking on board just, I suppose, successful examples and trying to avoid anywhere where it hasn't worked. So I think there's a lot of decisions to be taken just in the period ahead, and we will not delay, because I think that was important to say that whilst there are a number of things to be decided over the coming months, we will not delay in terms of trying to address them. So even whilst we move towards bringing forward the legislation around the public inquiry, etc., and redress, there are things, for example, avoiding knock-on impact on people's benefits. So we're going to engage with the Treasury, the Inland Revenue. For example, we need to do all that work now, and that's starting now. That starts today. There's no delay in that work. But whilst we work up the legislation, we'll work our way through all of that.
Call Pat Sheehan.
And I thank the Minister for her statement, and I welcome the commitment that the work in relation to this starts today. Can the Joint First Minister outline what immediate steps will be taken to progress the recommendations?
Thanks for that. And again, as we know, victims and survivors have waited too long, and one of the questions that was put to us this morning was around timeframes and what does that look like and what can we expect. And whenever you've been failed at every turn and whenever you've been waiting for so long, you can understand the anxiety that's there. So we've agreed that there's some things that we can take forward immediately, and the consultative forum, which I've spoken about now on a few occasions, is a key recommendation in the report. And that's going to be, there's actually a meeting to discuss that this afternoon, so we are actively already progressing that. We've said the independent panel will be in place within the next 6 months. We've said that we'll make the preparations for the legislation to establish the public inquiry. The financial redress, we're going to begin that work straight away. That's around, as I've said, engaging with the Treasury in London and working up the legislative pieces. And then also the Department of Health is also looking at, because this is a really crucial area of people having access to their information and their records, and this was universally accepted by all victims and survivors as a key area that needs to be addressed immediately and not another day delayed. So one of the things that Health are looking at this moment in time is, can we amend the Adoption and Children's Bill that's currently before the Assembly, which would allow us then to bring in that legislative change very quickly. So hopefully that demonstrates that that there's no long fingering of things here, that we are actively, as we speak, working our way through these things.
Nicole Bradley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome this statement and would like to align myself to the sentiments expressed across this House in support of victims and survivors. The Deputy First Minister did just touch on the issue I wanted to raise, and whilst I welcome a commitment to embrace all the recommendations, I am particularly eager and was pleased to hear that instruction to Council has already been issued in terms of the duty to preserve. And I do wonder, does that piece, just for clarity, does that need legislative underwriting, or is that something that can actively be embraced today in reaching out to those organisations to say that they must preserve all those documents or data that they may hold?
So, as I've said, the Department of Health have already started this work, and they have instructed legal counsel. So you do have to have legislation to underpin it. So can we amend the bill to allow us to be able to do that? But let me be very clear to all those organisations out there that have a role to play here. Everybody should be preserving your records. You shouldn't need to wait for legislation. That should be done today. There shouldn't be any delay. I'm aware, I think, that the Department of Health, I believe, have encouraged all organisations to do that, particularly within the health estate, however, or the health family, if you want to call them that. But I think that it's important that the message is heard today. We will be legislating to protect records, but records should be secured today, and I think that's important.
I call Alan Chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I certainly want to thank the Executive Office through the Deputy First Minister for this comprehensive statement today. Minister, this whole heart-wrenching story, going back many years, has been a very dark period and a stain in our history, and reflects badly on those who let it happen and allowed it to continue. And certainly, Minister, the love and compassion of Jesus was certainly in short supply in these institutions. My question is is the same question that Mrs. Bradley asked a few moments ago, that the Executive is bringing forward a statutory duty to compel retention of relevant records But is the Minister confident that some damning records may not already have been destroyed in an attempt to obstruct full disclosure? Thank you.
Yes, well, obviously we would be concerned about that, particularly given the passage of time, particularly given that these organisations deliberately set out to deny people access to information, to deny the victims and survivors access to information. So when they perpetrated this violence towards women, and then they've spent decades trying to cover it up, it doesn't bode any confidence in terms of their ability to do the right thing. So I just send the message again very clearly today that all information should be restored. Victims and survivors are entitled to have access to their information. It's theirs and it's been robbed of them, and it's time to give it back to them. And if we're going to be able to get a fulsome public inquiry and all the information out there, then this is a vital component part of that.
I now call Porrick Delargy.
Thank the Joint First Minister for his statement. Just on the back of the commitment that it will be implemented, can I ask the Joint First Minister to give her assurance that the process will commence urgently?
Yes, and that is so important that people can, as I said, I hope I've demonstrated just that that we are going to move at pace, that there will be no delay. You know, what we're talking about here is, you know, women being treated in the most barbaric way, and I think, as one of the members referred to earlier, this was child trafficking. It was a cover-up that involved both church and state. It's time now to do the right thing by victims and survivors. And if you indulge me, just when we met with the victims and survivors earlier, one of the things that was said to us was that that whilst our names might have, this was from the victims and survivors, so whilst our name might have changed in the past, we always mattered, and they want to hear that from us. And I want to say that to victims and survivors: you matter. You've always mattered, and I just want us to say that, send that message to them today, because I think it's important as we get to this point of acknowledging and accepting that we need to do the things that we need to do. They need to hear that also.
Call Andrew Muir.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank you, the Deputy First Minister, for her statement. And I think it's important to acknowledge the lifelong pain and trauma that many have endured, and it's important that it's acknowledged. In terms of the apology, is there an envisaged timescale for that? Because I think it's an important thing, but it has to be done correctly, and I think an understanding of the timescale for that would be important. Thank you.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think the principal point of it has to be done correctly is so important. So what we've said this morning with the victims and survivors is that we'll work with them through the consultative panel, and then we'll quickly, I don't have a time frame per se, but I can assure you that we'll do it as quickly as possible, but I want to stand before you and do it right, and before the victims and survivors, and do it right and do it justice.
Sir Nicola Brogan, I now call Nicola Brogan.
And can I thank the Joint First Minister for her statement as well, and I welcome the emphasis within the statement on the importance of victims and survivors having access to records here in this jurisdiction. But as the Minister is aware, babies were moved right across this island, so can she detail out how access to records held in the south will be facilitated as well, please?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, because the member's right to highlight the need for an all-island approach to this, and for that cooperation, particularly in the cases where babies were moved across jurisdictions, and we know that's the real experience of so many. So the panel have made a recommendation that we should cooperate with the Irish Government to achieve maximum possible access to information, and I can say that this process has started at official level, and it will intensify in the period ahead. I have also raised it with the Children's Minister previously in the south, and we'll continue to do that, but I think that is going to be really, really important that we have that joined up approach exactly right, because it'll have an implication in terms of people getting full access to all of their information.
Sir Pat Catney I call Pat Catney.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and thank you, Joint First Ministers, for giving the report here today. It represents a major step forward, as already stated, but out of the 10,500 women that went through those institutions, there are some of them that probably want to remain anonymous, and everything must be done that possibly can be done to keep their identity as private as they would like it to be. Do you agree?
Yes, of course, and that's why I think the way that we are responding and taking on board the panel's recommendations, particularly around us having the statutory inquiry and then the panel work, I think that allows the individual to decide which part they wish to be part of, and it's very, very important that their identity is protected through all of that, so no one will be compelled. People will have a choice in which avenue to take, or both. They can participate in both also. But I think that is essential if we're going to allow victims and survivors to participate in a way that's meaningful and important to them.
I call Roy Beggs.
Deputy Speaker, I welcome the statement by the First and Deputy First Minister indicating they will be adopting the recommendations of the panel. But turning to recommendation number 5 under redress and reparation, it speaks of engagement with non-state institutions, organisations and agencies to establish potential financial contribution. Now, these non-state organisations and institutions abused women. They inflicted a modern form of slavery long after it was banned, and they profited from that slavery. So my question is, what process will be put in place so that there will be significantly appropriate reparation for what has occurred from these non-state organisations and institutions?
Well, it's time for them to do the right thing. It's time for them to pay for and support the redress that victims and survivors are entitled to. What we're saying is that we will engage with them in terms of their contribution. However, we will legislate to compel, and I think that's important. It'll not be a case of, will they, won't they? They will be compelled to comply if they don't comply.
Call Rachel Woods.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Deputy First Minister for making the statement today, and let's call it for what it is. This is one of the greatest scandals of our time, and last week a number of us met with representatives of Youth Recovery Northern Ireland, and I thank them for their openness and honesty and engaging with us during that meeting, and I do hope that all records and information will be retained and released when required, and I hope that interpretation of GDPR is not going to be an issue either, as that was a crucial point that was raised with us. But I know that this is now going to be led by the Executive Office rather than Health, and so can the Deputy First Minister commit that adequate funding and resources will be allocated from the Executive Office for long-term support services for victims and survivors of the mother and baby institutions?
Well, can I concur just in terms of the fact that this was a shameful truth in our history? And, I think that we all recognise that as we stand here today, this has been a very long and a very difficult journey for the victims and survivors. And we all readily acknowledge the abhorrent failure and I suppose the trauma that was inflicted on women and girls. So now is the time for us to respond and to show them that we hear them, that we're listening to them, we acknowledge what happened and it was wrong, and we're going to work with them in terms of redress. So we've taken on board all of the recommendations, including funding a redress scheme. So the political priority is there, and we have to find the money to do the right thing by these victims and survivors.
Thank you, members. That concludes questions on the statement. Thank you, Joint First Minister. Just members take their ease while we